Picture a print shop in London, respectable, old, the kind of firm that has been printing serious things for serious people for the better part of a century: banknotes, stamps, share certificates, the paper money of whole nations. The presses are running, and what they are printing tonight is money, real money, genuine Portuguese banknotes, 500 escudos each, the good paper, the right ink, the portrait of an explorer named Vasco da Gama gazing out across the sea. There is nothing fake about these notes. They come off the same presses, from the same plates, as every other legal note in Portugal. The men running the machines think they are doing an honest night's work for an honest customer. They are wrong, because the man who ordered this print run does not work for the Bank of Portugal. He forged a contract. He forged the signatures, and he is about to walk away with a mountain of perfectly real money that was never, ever supposed to exist. Now stop and just admire that for a second. He didn't counterfeit a single note. He got the real printer, the official one, to make his money for him. And I have loved this story quietly, obsessively, for years. So let me tell you how a nobody from Lisbon convinced the world's money to print itself, and what it cost the people who never even met him. I'm Eddie, by the way. I should introduce myself, since you're going to be stuck with me for the next half hour. I'm the sort of man who reads about swindlers the way other people read about saints, with a kind of helpless admiration I'm not entirely proud of. I've never pulled a con in my life, if we're being honest, mostly because every scheme I've ever cooked up with my mate Sully has fallen apart somewhere between the pub and the front door. But I study them. The great ones. The clean ones. The cons so audacious they loop right back around from criminal to almost beautiful, and then always land on somebody's head who didn't deserve it. That last part matters to me, and I'll keep coming back to it, because a con is only a magic trick until you remember there's a real person on the other side of it. But the trick tonight is a masterpiece. So pour yourself something, settle in, and let me walk you through the single most elegant piece of financial nerve I have ever come across. The man who made a bank print him real money. His name was Artur Alves Reis, and I want you to understand him before I show you what he did, because the con doesn't make sense without the man, and the man is, frankly, the most relatable part of the whole affair, which is exactly what unsettles me about him. Reis was born in Lisbon in the late 1890s, the son of an undertaker who went bankrupt. Not grand, not connected, not one of the old families who ran Portugal from their drawing rooms. He was a clever, ambitious, restless young man with expensive taste and an empty name. And if you've ever felt the gap between the life you're living and the life you're sure you deserve, then congratulations. You already understand the engine that drove everything that followed. Reis was hungry, not for bread, for greatness. He wanted to be a great man, an important man, the kind of man other men stand up for when he enters the room. And he was absolutely convinced he had the brains for it. The world just hadn't handed him the stage yet, so he decided to build his own. Here's an early one, just to show you the shape of his mind. As a young man, he wanted a good job in the Portuguese colony of Angola, and good jobs wanted qualifications he didn't have. So he produced a diploma, a splendid diploma from an engineering school at Oxford, a school that, I should tell you, he had never attended, from a faculty that arguably didn't even exist in the form he claimed. He certified it himself, exploited the fact that nobody was going to write to England to check, and he got the job. And it worked. He actually did the engineering work and by most accounts did it well. That's the thing about Reis that you have to hold on to. The lie was never that he was incompetent pretending to be able. The lie was about permission, about authority. He believed, deep down, that the only difference between him and the great men was a piece of paper saying he was allowed. And once you believe that, once you decide that authority is just paperwork, and paperwork is just something a clever man can produce well, there is really no limit to where that thought can take you. But every great con needs more than a con man. It needs a stage. It needs a world in exactly the right kind of trouble. And Portugal in the early 1920s was a country in trouble. Let me set the scene because it matters. Portugal had come out of the First World War battered and broke. It had been on the winning side, technically, but war is expensive whichever side you're on, and Portugal had spent money it didn't have and lost men it couldn't spare. The monarchy had been overthrown just over a decade before. The young republic that replaced it was a mess of short-lived governments, one toppling into the next, coup rumors in the cafes, nobody in charge for very long. The currency, the escudo, was sinking, losing its value month after month. Prices climbing. Confidence gone. And here's the piece that makes this con possible, the piece I need you to really sit with. In those days, the Bank of Portugal, a private bank, but the one with the legal right to issue the nation's money, did not print its own notes. Printing banknotes well is genuinely hard. You need specialist presses, specialist engravers, security features. So Portugal, like a lot of countries, farmed the job out. It hired a firm in London. A very good, very old, very respectable firm called Waterlow and Sons. So think about what that means. The physical, actual money of an entire nation was being manufactured in another country by a private company on the strength of contracts and letters and signatures sent across the sea. A chain of trust, running from Lisbon to London, held together by paperwork. Rule one of any con, my friend. You don't fight the system. You find the one seam in it where everybody trusts somebody else to have checked, and you climb in through the gap. Reis found the seam, and what he saw in it was breathtaking. He realized that if he could just convince Waterlow that he spoke for the Bank of Portugal, the printer would hand him real money, because from the printer's side there was no difference. A note is a note. The presses don't know who signed the order. Now here is where I have to be careful with you, and I want to be, because this channel has a rule, and the rule is that I tell you what a man did in history, so you can marvel at the nerve of it, not so you can go and try it. What kept Reis out of jail for as long as it did wasn't some secret you could copy. It was forgery, and forgery is just fraud with a nicer pen, and it lands you in exactly the same prison. So I'm going to tell you the shape of it, the audacity of it, and I'm going to leave the howdo in the ground where it belongs. Deal? Deal. Around 1924, Reis got hold of a real contract, the sort of official document the Bank of Portugal used in its dealings, and he studied it. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, how the machinery of authority actually looked on paper. The letterhead, the phrasing, the seals, the signatures of the men at the top of the bank, and he assembled a small group of accomplices, foreign businessmen and go-betweens with just enough real standing to open doors, and together they built a story. The story was this: a secret arrangement, they claimed, in which the Bank of Portugal had authorized a special print run of banknotes to fund development in Angola, the colony, a plausible-sounding hush-hush, off-the-books injection of money into a struggling colonial economy. Sensitive, confidential, the kind of thing, they implied, that governments do quietly because doing it loudly would move the markets. And to prove this arrangement, Reis produced documents. A contract, apparently signed and sealed by directors of the Bank of Portugal, appointing him and his associates to arrange the printing on the bank's behalf. It was, of course, entirely false. The signatures were forged. The authorization did not exist. No director of the Bank of Portugal had ever agreed to any of it. And this is the whole con in a single sentence. The documents looked exactly like what a real authorization would look like, and there was no easy way from London to pick up a telephone and check. The chain of trust had a gap in it, and Reis had filled the gap with beautiful, convincing, utterly fraudulent paper. So now he takes his beautiful paper to the printer, and here I have to introduce you to the mark, because Waterlow and Sons were not fools. I want to be fair to them, genuinely, because they get painted as idiots, and they weren't. They were one of the most respected security printers in the world. They printed money and stamps for governments across the globe. They were careful people, professional people, the sort of firm whose entire business depended on being trustworthy. And that, I promise you, this is the heart of it. That is precisely why the con worked on them. Rule 1 again, in a different key. The best mark is not a greedy fool. The best mark is a competent professional doing his job correctly, whose whole world assumes that the paperwork in front of him is real, because in his experience it always has been. Reis didn't beat Waterlow's expertise. He got underneath it. The man at Waterlow he dealt with, a director named Sir William Waterlow, was shown the documents, the contract, the authorizations, the signatures of Bank of Portugal officials he had every reason to believe were genuine, because they matched the real signatures the firm already had on file. He was told this was a confidential government matter. He was even told, and I love this detail, that these new notes would be a special issue for Angola, so it wouldn't matter that they carried the same design as notes already in circulation. It all hung together. It was internally consistent. It was signed by the right hands. And so, believing he was serving a valued client, the Bank of Portugal itself, Sir William agreed to print the notes. Let that land. The head of one of the finest printing houses in the world personally approved the manufacture of a fortune in genuine currency for a man who had no right to a single note of it, not because he was careless, because he was trusting the paper, and the paper was a lie. Now let me stop and make sure you feel the full weight of what makes this con different from every other money scam in history. Because if you take one thing away tonight, take this. A counterfeiter makes fake money. He engraves his own plates, he mixes his own ink, he tries to imitate the real thing, and he can be caught the moment an expert looks closely because his notes are, underneath everything, forgeries. They're wrong. They only have to be examined to fail. Reis's notes could not fail that test because they weren't forgeries. They were real. Same official plates. Same paper, same ink, same presses, same skilled workmen. The 500 escudo notes with Vasco da Gama on them that came out of that print run were, physically, chemically, in every way an expert could measure, absolutely identical to the legal money of Portugal, because they were the legal money of Portugal. The only thing wrong with them was invisible. It wasn't in the note. It was in a filing cabinet in Lisbon, in the fact that no one had actually authorized them to exist. That's the masterpiece. He didn't forge the money. He forged the permission and let the real system manufacture the money on his behalf. He turned the entire machinery of a legitimate state, its printer, its plates, its good name, into an unwitting employee. The Bank of Portugal was, without knowing it, printing money for a private citizen and would have to honor every note because it genuinely could not tell them apart from its own. How do you even investigate that? How do you hunt for counterfeits when there aren't any? Every note is real. That's the trap he built, and for a long while it was perfect. So how much did he take? Here I have to give you my usual honest warning, because accuracy matters more to me than a good round number. The figures in this story get repeated so often they've gone a bit smooth, like coins that have passed through too many hands, and different historians give slightly different totals. So treat these as the well-supported estimates that they are, not gospel. The scale was enormous. Over the operation, Reis and his circle arranged for something on the order of 200,000 of those 500 escudo notes. Do the multiplication. 200,000 notes at 500 escudos each is around 100 million escudos. In the money of the day, that was roughly £1,000,000 sterling, and £1,000,000 in the 1920s was a staggering, life of a nation kind of sum. But the raw number isn't even the shocking part. The shocking part is the proportion. That flood of notes has been estimated at close to 1% of Portugal's entire annual economic output. One man, with some forged paper and a great deal of nerve, quietly conjured up something in the neighborhood of 1% of a country's whole economy. And it was real, spendable money, pouring into circulation from nowhere. He had, in effect, given himself the power to print a nation's currency, a power that is supposed to belong to the state alone, guarded like a crown jewel, and he'd just taken it with a pen. Now, a mountain of real banknotes is a wonderful problem to have, but it is still a problem. Because if Artur Alves Reis, the bankrupt Undertaker's son, suddenly starts spending like a prince, people ask questions. So he had to do the other half of the job. He had to wash the money into the world quietly and turn suspicious cash into respectable wealth. And his solution was, I have to say, gorgeous in its cheek. He didn't hide the money in a mattress. He founded a bank. His own bank in Lisbon and in Angola, the Bank of Angola and Metropole. Think about the elegance of that. If you own a bank, then great rivers of cash flowing through your hands stop looking like a crime and start looking like business. A bank is a machine for making money look normal. He hired currency traders to feed his notes into circulation, buying up foreign currency and gold, spreading the escudos out across Portugal, and beyond so no single suspicious pile ever sat in one place. And then he lived. Oh, he lived. He bought property. He bought fine things. He moved through Lisbon as the great man he had always known himself to be, a financier, a man of consequence, showering money on a poor and desperate country that was only too happy to have a new hero with deep pockets. To the people around him, he wasn't a swindler. He was a savior, a patriotic tycoon investing in Portugal when Portugal badly needed investing in. The notes were real. The wealth was real. The respect was real. The only thing that wasn't real was where it all came from, and that was the one thing nobody could see. And now we arrive at the moment where Reis stops being merely a brilliant crook and becomes something close to a tragic figure. Because this is where the hunger that built him starts, very quietly, to eat him. Reis had a problem he could see coming. There was always a chance someday that someone at the Bank of Portugal would start to wonder about all these notes. And he came up with a solution so audacious that when I first read it, I actually laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen. He decided to buy the Bank of Portugal. Not a metaphor. He set out to use his flood of freshly printed escudos to secretly purchase a controlling stake in the very institution he was defrauding. Do you see the perfect, insane logic of it? If he owned the Bank of Portugal, then if anyone ever opened an investigation into these mysterious duplicate notes, the man in charge of that investigation would answer, ultimately, to him. He could steer it, bury it, make the questions go away from the inside. He would use the fake money to buy the real institution, and then use the real institution to protect the fake money, the snake swallowing its own tail. He was, by some accounts, well on his way, quietly buying up shares, getting closer and closer to the point where the poacher would own the whole estate. And that, right there, is the moment I always want to reach into history and grab him by the collar. Because he'd won. Do you understand? He'd already won. He was rich beyond his dreams, respected, untouched. If he'd stopped, taken his fortune, and simply become the great man he'd always wanted to be, he might have died old and honored in a fine house by the sea. But the whole thing that made him was that he could never, ever believe he had enough authority yet. There was always one more piece of paper to acquire, one more room he wasn't allowed into. The hunger doesn't switch off just because you've been fed. It never does. That's the tragedy hiding inside every great con, and it was hiding inside this one all along. So how does a con with no counterfeits, no fake notes, nothing to physically catch, how does a thing that perfect finally come apart? It comes apart on the one detail the whole scheme could never solve. The serial numbers. Here's the crack at the center of the masterpiece. When Waterlow printed the notes, they used the same plates as the real, authorized notes. That was the genius, remember. That's what made them genuine. But that also meant the notes carried serial numbers, and some of those numbers duplicated the numbers on notes that the Bank of Portugal was already, legitimately, putting into circulation through its normal channels. Two different notes, printed at different times for different masters, wearing the same identity. Now for a while, that's fine. A country has millions of notes floating around. Nobody is cross-checking serial numbers by hand. But rumors had already been swirling. There was just so much cash suddenly sloshing around Lisbon, and this new Bank of Rises spending so freely, that some people had started to mutter. Journalists poked at it. And then came the moment the whole edifice had been quietly waiting for. As the story is told, and it's told this way so often precisely because it's so neat, money changers and bank officials examining the flood of 500 escudo notes found two of them bearing the exact same serial number. And that is impossible. That should never happen. Two genuine notes, unquestionably real in every physical way, with the same serial number, cannot both exist, unless somebody somewhere has printed the same note twice, which meant the notes were real and the authorization was fake, which pointed a trembling finger straight at whoever had commissioned that extra print run. And the trail, the contracts, the traders, the new bank, the sudden fortune led, of course, to Artur Alves Reis. The Bank of Portugal moved fast and hard once it understood. It recalled the entire 500 escudo note, every single one, the real ones and the fraudulent ones together, because it could not tell them apart, and pulling all of them was the only way to be sure. Imagine that, an entire denomination of a nation's currency, yanked out of existence because one man had counterfeited permission instead of paper. Reis was arrested in December of 1925. The great man, undone at last not by a better detective, not by a rival, but by a number. The one thing his forged paperwork could never reach in and change. And here is where I stop admiring, and you should too, because this is the part the clever version of this story always rushes past. What did it cost? It cost a great deal, and almost none of it landed on Reis. When the truth came out, the damage wasn't just to one bank's balance sheet. It was to something far harder to rebuild: trust. Ordinary Portuguese people had been handing over their goods, their work, their savings, in exchange for those notes. And now the whole country learned that a chunk of the money in their pockets had been conjured out of a forgery. that the guardians of the currency had been made to look either crooked or hopelessly incompetent, and that nobody, apparently, had been minding the store. When people stop believing that money is real, or that the institutions behind it are sound, something deep and load-bearing gives way. Portugal's young, wobbling republic simply could not absorb the blow. The scandal poured petrol on a fire that was already burning. The endless unstable governments, the sinking economy, the public contempt for a political class that couldn't keep order. And in 1926, the year after Reis's arrest, the military seized power in a coup. The fragile democracy was over. Out of the wreckage and the desperate hunger for a steady hand on the nation's finances rose a quiet, austere professor of economics named Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who would go on to rule Portugal as a dictator for decades. Now, let me be honest and careful, because I always will be. I'm not going to stand here and tell you one con man single-handedly caused a dictatorship. History is never that tidy, and anyone who tells you it is selling you something. Portugal's republic was in deep trouble before Reis ever forged a signature, and it might well have fallen anyway. But historians widely agree that this scandal, this spectacular, humiliating proof that the country's money and its institutions could be played like a cheap fiddle, was one real push among the many that helped topple it. A nudge, at exactly the wrong moment, against a wall already leaning. And the man who nudged it did it chasing nothing grander than his own reflection in a bigger mirror. As for the players, Reis stood trial and he spent around 20 years in prison, the great man, the financier, the would-be owner of the Bank of Portugal, sitting in a cell while the world he'd built dissolved. When he finally got out, there was no fortune waiting. It was gone, seized, spent, evaporated. He died in Lisbon in 1955, by every account a poor man, a broke and largely forgotten one. The hunger that had driven him to make a bank print him a fortune left him, in the end, with less than the Undertaker's son he'd started as. There's a bitter kind of justice in that, and there's also just sadness. He could have been genuinely brilliant at something honest. He was certainly clever enough. He just couldn't bear to be small. And Waterlow, the printer, the mark, the respectable firm that had trusted the paper. The Bank of Portugal sued them in the British courts, arguing that Waterlow should never have printed those notes, that a competent security printer bore responsibility for handing a fortune in real currency to an unauthorized man. It became a famous, drawn-out legal battle that went all the way up through the British legal system. And in the end, the Bank of Portugal won. Waterlow was held liable for the damage, a devastating judgment for a proud old firm whose entire value was its reputation for being the safe pair of hands. The company was ruined by it. Sir William Waterlow's career was broken. 100 years of respectability, undone because one clever stranger had walked in with the right signatures on the wrong contract. Everyone paid. The printer paid. The country paid. The ordinary people paid. And the con man, in his way, paid last and longest in a cold room with nothing. The only thing nobody ever quite got back was the thing he'd stolen in the first place, which wasn't really the money. It was the trust. And that's what I keep circling back to, long after the fun of the trick has worn off. Because I came to this story for the audacity. I genuinely did. I came for the sheer nerve of a man making a nation's printer run him off a fortune. And I stayed for something that's been quietly bothering me ever since. Reis didn't break into a vault. He didn't crack a safe or pick a lock or point a gun at anyone. He walked in through the front door of the most guarded system there is, using nothing but paperwork that looked right. He weaponized the one thing that actually holds the modern world together, The fact that we all, constantly, trust that somebody else already checked. Think about how much of your life runs on exactly that. The pay that lands in your account, the deed to the home you live in, the medicine with the label you believe, the contract you signed without reading every line, the official-looking email, the message from the bank, the form that just needs a signature. We cannot verify all of it ourselves. We'd never get out of bed, so we trust the letterhead, the seal, the signature, the confident voice that says this is authorized, this is real, this has been approved. And that trust is a good thing. It's the grease in the gears. It's what lets a whole society function. But it is also precisely the seam. It is exactly where the clever ones climb in. Rise is 100 years dead, but the trick isn't. The trick is timeless. It just wears newer clothes now. My nephew, I've mentioned him before, sharp kid, thinks he's far too smart to be fooled. My nephew very nearly handed his savings to a message that looked, for all the world, like it came from his bank. Right letterhead, right logo, right confident official voice saying this is authorized, act now. Same con, same seam, same weaponized trust aimed at one kid instead of one country. He caught it just with about a minute to spare because for 1 second, instead of believing the paper, he actually picked up the phone and checked. Which is the whole thing. That's the entire defense. That one boring, unglamorous second of actually checking. So that's my question for you tonight, and I do read the comments, so come find me down there. When was the last time you almost trusted something official, a document, an email, a call, a form, a confident voice that turned out to be a lie? Did you catch it or did it catch you? And what was the tiny detail, the serial number of your own story that finally gave it away? Tell me. I collect these the way I collect the old ones, and honestly yours are the ones that might save the next person reading. Put it below. I'll leave you with this. Artur Alves Reis proved something I find genuinely chilling and genuinely beautiful in the same breath. That the walls guarding the most valuable things in the world are often made not of steel, but of paper. And paper only holds if somebody, somewhere, actually reads it. He found the one door everybody assumed the other man had locked. Half of me will always admire the nerve it took to walk through it. The other half remembers a whole country on the other side, paying for his hunger with their trust. That's the deal with every great con in the end. Somebody always finds out it was real money after all, and it was never, ever theirs to spend. I'm Eddie. Check the paperwork. Trust the boring second. And that's how you lose your shirt.